The sun blazed mercilessly over the canyon, baking the river stones until they burned against the skin. She stood waist-deep in the water, her breath sharp in her throat, clutching a tattered cloth to her chest. Moments earlier, her life had still been her own, until strangers on horseback had chased her into the river like prey. Now, with every drop of water trickling down her skin, she could feel their judgment crawling over her like ants. Behind her, a man stood in the shallows. Not a rescuer, not yet. His eyes carried the same fire as the desert, but whether it would burn her chains or forge new ones, that remained to be seen. The canyon walls loomed like silent witnesses, as if the whole land was holding its breath for what came next. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about dignity stolen in broad daylight, about the way a woman could be hunted for sport and no one would raise a hand. It was about rage, hot, choking rage, that no river could wash away. Somewhere beyond the bend, riders waited. Somewhere, the ones who had ordered this humiliation thought they'd already won. But they hadn't seen what happened when shame turned into fury, and fury found an ally. The man didn't move at first. The river whispered between them, carrying away the echoes of the horses that had driven her here. His shadow stretched long across the water, and for a moment, it felt like a wall, one she could either crash into or shelter behind. "I'm not here to hurt you," he finally said, voice low, the kind that made a person lean in or walk away forever. She didn't answer. The canyon had taught her that words could be weapons just as sharp as any blade, and right now, she had no reason to believe his would be any different. Then she saw it, the flicker in his eyes when he looked past her, up toward the ridge. She turned just enough to catch the movement. Two riders silhouetted against the sun, watching. They weren't retreating. They were waiting. Waiting to see if the river would spit her out or swallow her whole. She gripped the cloth tighter, nails biting into her palms, and that's when she realized. This wasn't just about shame anymore. This was a game to them. They wanted her to feel hunted, small, cornered. But something shifted in her chest. A spark, buried under days of running and nights of hiding, caught fire. Maybe it was the way the man's hand hovered near his holster, like he'd already chosen which side he was on. Maybe it was the memory of her father's voice telling her that the land doesn't belong to the ones with the most guns, but to the ones willing to bleed for it. "Do you know who they are?" she asked, her voice steadier than she expected. "Yeah," he said, without looking away from the ridge. "And they know me." The river seemed colder now, the air heavier. She didn't know yet if that meant danger or salvation, but she did know one thing. Whatever happened next, the canyon would remember it. And as they started toward the bank side by side, the riders on the ridge began to move. "Before we go further, I want you to tell me, if you were standing in that river with strangers waiting to decide your fate, would you run, fight, or stand your ground? Drop your answer in the comments." They climbed the riverbank in silence, boots sinking into wet sand, the sound of dripping water swallowed by the open canyon. Her bare feet stung on the stones, but she didn't slow down. The man kept a step ahead, scanning the ridge as if expecting trouble to come sliding down it at any moment. When they reached the dry ground, he shrugged off his coat and held it out. She hesitated, searching his face for the catch, the mocking smirk, the unspoken demand. There was none. Just the same wary look, like he wasn't sure if she'd take it or throw it back. She wrapped it around herself anyway. "Those men up there," she said, her voice low but edged like glass. "They're not here for a debt or a bounty. They're here because they think they can own me." His jaw tightened. "They don't own you, and if they try, they'll answer for it." That should have been enough, but she'd lived too long under the weight of empty promises. "Words are cheap," she muttered. "Then watch me make them worth something," he replied, already checking the revolver at his hip. A gust of wind swept through the canyon, carrying the faint jingle of bridles. The riders had descended, slow and deliberate, closing the gap with the patience of predators. She could see them now, faces shadowed under wide brims, rifles slung low. One of them wore a silver badge, but it gleamed like a lie in the sun. "They'll talk first," the man murmured. "Try to make it sound like you've got no choice. Don't believe a word." She didn't need the warning. She'd heard the same kind of talk before, smooth voices offering safety in exchange for obedience, protection in exchange for silence. Every deal was just another kind of cage. This time, she wasn't walking into one. The riders reined in a dozen yards away. The leader's voice was all false civility. "You've got something that belongs to us," he called. The man beside her didn't flinch. "Funny," he said. "I was thinking the same about you." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the leader's smile curdled. His hand twitched toward his rifle, and the air seemed to snap tight around them. She could feel her heart pounding, not with fear, but with a sharp, dangerous clarity. If it came to a fight, she wouldn't just be the reason for it, she'd be part of it. And deep down, she hoped it would come to that. The canyon felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to witness what was about to happen. Heat shimmered between the two groups, the river behind her whispering like it knew that once a shot was fired, it would carry the blood away just as easily as it carried the dust. The man at her side stood solid, boots planted, one hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. He didn't look at her, but she felt the weight of his presence, the kind that could either anchor you or pull you under. The riders began to spread out. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to put her in a neat little triangle of rifles. The one with the silver badge leaned forward in his saddle, the creak of leather loud in the silence. "Let's not make this harder than it has to be," he said, voice carrying the smug ease of someone used to being obeyed. "She's ours by law." She almost laughed, an ugly, bitter laugh that had been building in her chest for years. Law. The same law that turned its back when her mother was dragged from their home. The same law that called her a vagrant when she refused to belong to anyone. "You've got no law here," the man beside her said, his voice low but sharp enough to cut. "Just a habit of taking what isn't yours." The badge holder's smile faltered, replaced by a sneer. "You don't want to cross me, Rourke," so that was his name. Rourke. It fit, short, solid, a name that sounded like it could outlast a storm. "Already did," Rourke said, and his hand dropped just a little closer to his gun. She knew this moment. Had lived it in different forms, always the same ingredients. Men who believed the world bent for them, a woman caught between fight and surrender, and the thin, terrible silence before violence. But something was different now. She wasn't alone, and the anger that had been coiled in her gut for so long had found direction. Without meaning to, she took a step forward. The badge holder's eyes flicked to her, calculating, dismissive. "Girl, don't call me girl," she snapped, and for the first time, the riders hesitated. It wasn't the words. It was the way she said them, like a crack had opened in the ground and they weren't sure how deep it went. Rourke's head turned slightly, just enough for her to catch the ghost of a smirk. Not mockery, approval. The badge holder straightened, trying to recover his rhythm. "You've got one chance to walk away from this. And you've got one chance to ride out of here with your teeth still in your mouth," Rourke replied. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of dust and horses, rustling the dry brush at their feet. She could feel the moment tilting, the balance shifting. One wrong move and the canyon would erupt. And then, from somewhere beyond the ridge, a whistle cut through the air, high, sharp, and deliberate. The riders froze. Even Rourke's eyes narrowed. More horses appeared at the far edge of the ridge, 6, maybe 7, moving fast. Their riders weren't dressed like the badge holders' men. No uniforms, no badges. Just dust-stained clothes and the hard, watchful eyes of people who had nothing to lose. Her breath caught. She knew one of those faces. Nayan. A woman who had vanished months ago after swearing she'd never be taken alive. The badge holder swore under his breath. "This isn't your fight," he barked toward the newcomers. "Looks like it is," Nayan called back, her voice carrying across the canyon. "You've been hunting in the wrong territory." The tension didn't break. It deepened, the air so tight it felt like breathing too hard could set it off. Rourke didn't move. Neither did the badge holder. But the math had changed, and everyone knew it. She realized then that this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every woman who'd been dragged off under the excuse of law, every man who'd looked away, every silent canyon that had swallowed a scream. The whistle came again, and this time it sounded like a signal. Rourke's fingers curled around the grip of his revolver. You've got about 3 seconds to decide, he told the badge holder. 1. The sound of leather shifting. 2. A horse snorting, pawing the ground. 3. The silence between 3 and what came next was thin as a gun barrel. Then the crack of the first shot split the canyon. No one saw whose gun barked first. It didn't matter. Once the echo hit the walls, chaos poured in like floodwater. Horses screamed, rifles cracked, and the air filled with dust and the metallic sting of gunpowder. Rourke moved before she could think, his hand locking around her arm, pulling her behind a jagged outcrop of stone. She stumbled, clutching his coat tighter, the sound of bullets chipping rock inches from her head. "They're trying to drive us toward the ridge," he shouted over the gunfire. She risked a glance around the rock. The badge holder's men were fanning out, herding them toward open ground where their rifles could cut clean. But the newcomers, Nayan's crew, weren't giving way. They were riding hard into the choke point, firing with the precision of people who had been shot at before and learned to live through it. Something hot flared in her chest. Not just fear, but a pulse of recognition. This wasn't a rescue. It was a reckoning. A bullet smacked into the stone above them, showering grit over her hair. Rourke's jaw was tight, his eyes calculating angles. "You know how to shoot?" She hesitated only a breath. "I know how to hit what I aim at." His revolver was in her hand before she'd finished speaking. It was heavier than she expected, the worn grip warm from his palm. She braced against the rock, picked a target, a man swinging his rifle toward Nayan, and squeezed. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, but the rider pitched sideways, his hat flying off as he hit the dirt. She'd never shot a man before. The sickness she expected didn't come, just a cold clarity. "Good," Rourke said, already firing again. "Keep them off the women on horseback. They're our way out." Another whistle cut the air. 2 short bursts this time. Nayan's signal. Her riders began to wheel, pushing the fight toward the far slope. The badge holder shouted orders, but the tide was slipping out of his hands. Then she saw it, a glint of steel from the corner of her eye. One of the badge holder's men had broken from the fray, circling low along the riverbank. Not toward Rourke, toward her. He came fast, boots pounding the sand, a knife flashing in his hand. She raised the revolver, but he slammed into her before she could fire, the impact knocking them both into the shallows. Cold water exploded around them, the revolver tumbling from her grip. Her breath caught under the weight of him, the knife pressed against her jaw, the stench of sweat and horse on his breath. "Should have stayed where you belonged," he hissed. She drove her knee into his ribs, hard enough to hear the grunt rip out of him. His hand wavered. She grabbed his wrist with both hands, twisting until the knife skittered into the water. He swung at her, catching her cheek with a glancing blow that sent sparks through her vision. Then he was gone, hauled backward by Rourke, who had appeared out of nowhere like the canyon itself had spat him out. 2 quick punches dropped the man face first into the water. Rourke didn't look at her. "Get your gun." She found it half buried in the sand and came up ready. Together they pushed toward the slope where Nayan's crew had carved a path. Horses thundered past, close enough for her to feel the wind off their flanks. The badge holder was still in the fight, but his men were thinning. And then, like the desert deciding it had seen enough, he was gone, spurring his horse up the far ridge, leaving the canyon strewn with the wounded and the dead. The shooting slowed, then stopped. Only the hiss of the river and the low moans of the injured filled the air. Nayan swung down from her horse, dust and blood streaking her face. "You're coming with us," she said, not as an offer but as a fact. She looked at Rourke, unsure if the answer was hers to give. His nod was small, but it said enough. As they moved to leave, she glanced back at the bodies on the ground. Men who had chased her for sport, now lying still under the same sun that had once burned her shame into her skin. She expected to feel lighter. She didn't. The rage was still there, coiled tight, whispering that this wasn't the end. Just a pause, because she knew the badge holder would come back. Men like him always did. And next time, he wouldn't just be hunting her. He'd be hunting all of them. They rode hard until the canyon gave way to open land, the air shifting from gunpowder and blood to the dry scent of sagebrush. No one spoke for miles. The only sounds were the pounding of hooves and the soft creak of leather saddles. When they finally slowed near a cluster of wind-worn cottonwoods, Nayan raised her hand and the group came to a halt. Horses snorted, tossing their heads, while the riders instinctively formed a loose circle, half habit, half instinct, keeping watch in every direction. "You've got a trail of dust behind you a mile wide," Nayan said to Rourke without looking at him. "Badge holder won't be long before he's back on it." Rourke dismounted, his boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. "Then we use that time to decide if we're running or making sure he doesn't have a second chance." She stayed in the saddle, clutching the coat tighter around her. The adrenaline from the fight was fading, replaced by the ache in her cheek where the knife wielder had struck her, and a deep, gnawing anger that had nothing to do with bruises. Nayan finally turned to her. "What's your name?" For a moment, she hesitated. Her name had been twisted, shouted, and written in ledgers by men who thought it gave them power over her. Giving it now felt like laying down a piece of herself. But she lifted her chin. "Maris." Nayan nodded once. "Well, Maris, you've got a choice. You can ride with us until you're clear, or you can stay with him." She jerked her head toward Rourke. "I'm not a package to be handed off," Maris shot back, the words coming sharper than she expected. Rourke's gaze didn't waver. "Number you're not. Which is why you'll decide for yourself." The group shifted restlessly, the silence between them prickling like static. "I'll ride with you," Maris said finally, "but I'm not running forever." A faint smile curved Nayan's lips. "Good, because neither are we." They built a small fire in the shadow of the cottonwoods, careful to keep it low. As dusk bled across the sky, the conversation turned to strategy. Rourke spread a rough map on the ground, tracing a calloused finger over the jagged lines of canyons and ridges. "He's got a dozen riders left, maybe more coming from the towns he owns. If we keep moving west, he'll chase us into the flats. That's his ground." "Then we don't run west," Nayan countered. "We draw him into the gulch at Dry Hollow. Steep walls, narrow mouth, turns his numbers into a trap." Maris listened, her mind tugging at something unspoken. "If you know his ground and his numbers, then you've faced him before." Both Nayan and Rourke looked at her, a flicker of something passing between them. Rourke broke first. Years ago, before he had the badge. Back when he was just another hired gun. "And you didn't finish him then?" The question hung heavy. Rourke's jaw tightened. "I wasn't the man I am now." Maris felt a flash of frustration, the kind that came from realizing her life had been tossed in the wake of an old, unfinished fight. But underneath it, there was something else. A grim understanding that this wasn't about revenge for her alone. It was about every thread of history that had led them to this night. The firelight danced on Nayan's face as she spoke. "He doesn't stop, Maris. Not when the law's on his side and the towns are too scared to fight back. The only way this ends is if we make it end." Maris looked at the flames, the sparks rising into the dark. She thought about the women she'd seen taken, the ones who never came back. About her mother's voice swallowed by the canyon. About the moment she'd pulled the trigger earlier that day and felt nothing but certainty. "Then we end it," she said. Rourke met her eyes, and in that silent exchange, the decision settled like a loaded gun between them. The plan was simple in shape, complicated in execution. At dawn, they would ride to Dry Hollow, set the bait, and wait. Nayan's riders would control the high ground, forcing the badge holder's men into the choke point. Rourke and Maris would hold the mouth of the gulch. No one would leave without going through them. The fire burned low. Riders peeled off in pairs to keep watch. Maris found herself alone near the edge of the trees, the desert stretching black and endless before her. Somewhere out there, he was riding. She could almost feel the pull of his presence, like the hum of a storm on the horizon. She wasn't afraid. She was ready. When she turned back toward the camp, Rourke was there, watching. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes was clear. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. Not because fate had thrown them into the same river, but because they had chosen to walk the same trail out of it. "Before we close this part, I want to know, If you knew the fight ahead could cost you everything, but walking away meant letting the worst kind of men keep their power, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. And if you're ready to ride into Dry Hollow with us, hit subscribe, tap like, and keep watching, because the dawn that's coming will be painted in more than just sunlight. The heart of this story isn't just about gunfights, dusty trails, or the raw grit of the Wild West. It's about the cost of silence and the power of choosing to stand. Maris's journey reminds us that injustice doesn't survive because it's strong. It survives because too many look away, convinced it's not their fight. The badge holder is more than a single man. He represents a system that wears the mask of law while protecting cruelty. That mask only cracks when enough people are willing to risk breaking it, even if it means drawing fire. Rourke, Nayan, and their riders aren't saints. They're people who've been pushed too far to keep their heads down. The courage they show isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to act, despite knowing what it could cost. Maris learns that dignity isn't given back once it's stolen. It has to be taken, reclaimed in moments where you choose to fight instead of flee. She discovers that standing alone is dangerous, but standing with others, sharing the risk and the aim, turns survival into resistance. In life, there will always be badge holders, people or institutions who believe they can define your worth, control your body, or dictate your future. The lesson here is clear. Your worth is not theirs to measure, and your future is not theirs to decide. Sometimes, the right choice is not the safest one. Sometimes, it's the one that changes the trail for everyone who comes after you. And when that choice comes, remember Maris's path. Don't run from the fight if the fight is what keeps others from falling into the same canyon you escaped.